Before the video begins, I just wanted to discuss something serious. Mr. X DREAMS, an amazing narrator and friend of mine, his mother, one of the greatest human beings he's ever known, is in the battle of her life. In 2013, she was in nursing school when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Being the fighter that she is, she pushed through, became a hospice nurse, and provided comfort to the terminally ill for several years. Unfortunately, things have taken a turn for the worse in recent months. Shortly before her double mastectomy last weekend, they found that the cancer has become even more aggressive and has spread to many of her bones. The cost of the intensive treatments required to save her life is a huge burden, and although they are managing as well as they can, the time has come to reach out for help. After my narrations are complete, I am sharing a few narrations from my friend Mr. X DREAMS, and linked in the bio below is a GoFundMe page where you can donate to Mr. X DREAMS' mother's cause and help as much as you see fit. Thank you, and have an amazing night. I want to share a more long-term story that occurred over a period of year of my school career, my 8th grade year to be exact. I like to preface this by saying that I'm a male and bisexual, as well as only being 13 when this first started, so some of the decisions I made throughout this whole thing were pretty stupid on my part. Let's travel back in time to when my troubles started, the beginning of 8th grade. The year prepping me for what was to come in my high school career. I was excited for this year, especially when I found out that a new kid was joining my class. We'll call him Liam. Liam was a tall, skinny 15-year-old boy with black, curly hair and blue eyes. He also enjoyed the same interests I had at the time: gorillas, Steven Universe, drawing, all that jazz. As a hormone-filled 13-year-old who had just discovered his sexuality, I was immediately head over heels for him. But due to the fact that I go to a religious school, I knew I couldn't openly date him without getting into deep trouble. I had to suppress my feelings for him, which turned out to be a massive bullet dodge. I became friends with Liam, and we talked every day we got the chance to. During lunch, during class, even at home on Instagram. He was perfect for me. He was so easy to talk to, he was hilarious and just an all-around down-to-earth guy. 2 weeks after 8th grade, we were scheduled to go on a field trip, and Liam sat next to me on the bus. This was when it all really started, when his veil of who he really was began to slowly lift. The trip was a 3-hour journey to a museum, and I thought it would be great because of who I would get to spend my time with. The first half hour or so was great. We did our usual session of talking and joking with each other, when all of a sudden he began to stroke my knees. I had very sensitive knees, so it tickled. Laughing, I told him to stop because it tickled so bad. He then moved up his hand to my thigh and rubbed that instead. Part of me was a bit uncomfortable with this, but at the same time, I was a dumb 13-year-old that really liked this boy, and I wanted him to like me back, so I chose not to say anything or move seats. He did the same thing when we were going back to school after the trip. I regret not saying anything because maybe that could have saved me from a year of torture from this guy. Cut to around 3 weeks after this experience. Liam and I are chilling in the gym before physical education. He asked me to hold onto his phone, as his shorts didn't have pockets. I happily obliged and stuck the phone in my pocket. During our lap runs, I had to use the restroom, so I excused myself to the restroom to do my business. While inside, I remember that I had Liam's phone, and I felt a little nosy, so I decided to snoop to see what juicy secrets I could find out about my crush. He didn't have a password, so it was easy to access whatever I wanted. I decided to look in his gallery, and what I found took me aback. There were around 250 pictures of me in his camera roll. All just me. In class, during the trip, me and him. So I had known that he had taken others I did not. I thought this was creepy, but at the same time, stupid 13-year-old me was happy that Liam liked me enough to be the center of his photography. So, like his creepy actions before, I brushed this off. As the weeks went on, I noticed that Liam not only liked me, but was obsessed with me. It started off with me noticing small things, like he wore the same color and brand of shoes I wore, and then turned into more specific things, like t-shirts with specific bands and characters that I wore. I was more so flattered than creeped out at his actions and brushed them off once again. In December of 2016 was when I realized that what he was doing was creepy and disturbing. It was after school and my mother was running late, so Liam and I were chilling in one of the empty classrooms waiting on our parents. Liam's mother always worked a little late, so they always left school a little bit later than everyone else. I was sitting in the front of the classroom and Liam sat in the back. He had sat his bag down next to the classroom door, and since I was closer to the bag, he asked me to get a book from his bag. I said sure and walked over towards the bag. As I bent over to reach inside, Liam walked behind me and grabbed my butt with both of his hands. Startled, I turned around and asked him what he was doing, and he simply said that he was just goofing and wanted to mess with me. I had blown everything else off before, the pictures and the touching of my legs, but I knew that gripping my butt was just not okay. And now I was uncomfortable, and I decided that I didn't want to be in there with him anymore after that, and I decided to leave. He didn't follow me out and just sat with a blank face after I left the classroom. I reported what he did to the principal on the way out, but he didn't believe me, saying that I was just trying to start trouble, but would still talk to him about it, so I guess that's a great school system we've got here. The next day I walked into a class as usual, and Liam was sitting in the back, saving his usual spot next to him for me, but he had a cold, dead look in his eyes when he stared at me. I reluctantly sat down next to him and gave him a monotone, "Hey," but he said nothing in return. A few minutes go by in silence between us, other than the other kids having their own conversations or doing their own activities, when Liam leans over and whispers to me. What he whispered to me made my blood freeze, and their words I'll never forget. "You really tried to report me? I thought we had something. I'm gonna make your life a living hell." And he did just that. Every day for weeks on end, he would find a way to get to me and do whatever he wanted. He would manage to find times when I was alone and touch me, hurt me, or even worse. Even when crowded in the halls, he would do things like give a subtle butt grab when no one could see. It got so bad that I stopped going to the bathroom at all during school hours. I tried to report him, but no one would believe me, saying he's an exemplary student and wouldn't dare do something like this. I came home every day with a bruise and mental scarring, but I never told my parents in fear of them just automatically thinking that I'm doing it for attention. One time when I went to my locker, I opened it and a note fell out. I picked it up and opened it. Its contents made me feel physically ill. It was a typed-out letter from Liam detailing all of the disgusting and heinous acts he wanted to do to me. I tried to show it to the principal, believing that the letter would prove what Liam had done, but he said since the letter had been typed and wasn't signed by him, there was no proof that Liam had typed it, and even suggested that I was the one who typed it in an attempt to frame Liam for something he didn't do. All of my efforts to stop him were futile. I wasn't a violent person, so fighting him was not an option. Liam was a sociopathic monster, but he was smart. He managed to create a facade that he only broke when tormenting me. He was a star student as well as rather popular in our class. Compare that to me, an antisocial, somewhat rude and unpopular guy. He basically had the perfect target. Around February of 2017, my history teacher was fired for a different scandal involving voyeurism that I had no involvement with, and was replaced by a new teacher who I'll refer to as Mrs. Bennett. Mrs. Bennett was a wonderful young woman who managed to make her teaching fun and interesting, and was the only person who got me through this tough time with Liam. Mrs. Bennet took a liking to me because of my diligence and hard work I did during that class. Mrs. Bennet noticed I always looked tired and or sad whenever I walked by when leaving. So one day, as class ended, she pulled me aside and asked why I always looked so sad and tired during class. I was rather hesitant to say anything because I was worried that, like everyone else, she wouldn't believe me. But she seemed to genuinely care enough about me if she pulled me aside to privately talk to me, so I decided to tell her everything. What had happened over the past year, how it all started, and how it is now. She stared at me, eyes wide and jaw dropped, listening to all of the abuse this monster had given me and how the school did nothing to stop it. She just gave me a warm hug and apologized profusely for what happened to me and said that somehow, something would be done to stop it. I told her that I didn't want her to say anything to the higher-ups because I knew she could get into trouble because Liam could manipulate the situation to his favor. She said to not worry and that she wouldn't allow me to be hurt anymore. I left that classroom feeling happy for the first time in a while, knowing that somebody finally believes me for what he did to me. I felt like I had a sort of guardian angel. Mrs. Bennet kept her word on keeping me safe, as she kept a close eye on me between classes, always dismissing her classes 5 minutes in advance so she could walk close to my classroom and keep a close eye on me as I walked through the halls. Liam caught on to this and stopped touching me as he noticed Mrs. Bennet always eyeing him and I through the hall. I went to Mrs. Bennet's room after school whenever my mother was late, so that Liam couldn't touch or harm me after school either. I thought it was all over. But there was one last time that Liam tried to commit his sinister acts. It was around the end of April, and Liam hadn't attacked me or touched me since February, and I was resting easy, knowing that Mrs. Bennet was protecting me from his dirty, vile clutches. I was sitting in her classroom after school. I strangely didn't see Liam at all, even though he was at school earlier, so I figured he checked out early. Mrs. Bennet said she needed to run and collect copies of a test from the teacher's lounge, which was all the way on the other side of the school from the room we were in. After she had left, I needed to use the restroom, which was in the opposite direction of the teacher's lounge. I started walking to the restroom, passing all of the empty classrooms on either side of me, when I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Still a bit nervous, I turned around and saw nobody in sight. I figured my mind was playing tricks on me, so I walked another 50 feet to the restroom and used the stall. While inside, I hear the door to the restroom open, so I figured it was just another teacher staying late, needing to use it. But then the lights switched off. The power didn't go out. It was switched off because I heard the light switch click. I was petrified as I sat in total blackness, but this didn't even compare to what happened next. I heard the voice of Liam say in a sing-songy voice, "Come out. I've missed you." I was on the verge of tears at this point, but dared not make a sound as I heard him slowly walking through the bathroom. I was on the last stall at the end, and to my horror he began checking the stalls, trying to find me. After snapping out of my frozen fear, I prepared for him to open the door to my stall. He knew that I was in this last stall, laughing and taunting me while standing on the other side of the stall door, which was his biggest mistake. I bowed my legs back, and as soon as he opened the door, kicked the door back in his face with full force. I heard him yell in pain and fall backward from the impact. I took this time to pull up my pants and run out of the restroom, with him following close behind. As soon as I burst out of the restroom, Liam burst out right behind me and tackled me to the floor. He had a large pocket knife in his hand and successfully slashed me a few times on my arms and hands. I heard Mrs. Bennet yell to get off of me, and ran over to tackle Liam to the ground, wrestling the knife out of his hand. At this point, other teachers who hadn't left the building had come outside to see what the commotion was. Mrs. Bennet was screaming for teachers to call 911 while I was laying on the hallway floor, sobbing profusely, and my arms in a bloody mess. The police came and arrested Liam, and I was taken to the hospital in an ambulance. My parents were notified, and they showed up at the hospital in hysterics over what just happened to me. Finally, after my wounds were stitched up and I rested for a while, my parents came in hugging me, asking what had happened. So I explained to them what had been going on in the past school year, and they were both crying and apologizing profusely for not noticing that something was wrong sooner. I also got a written apology from the school principal, basically asking me not to sue, but I didn't care about that anymore. The important thing was that this sick freak was caught and couldn't harm me or anyone else. As for Liam, he was sent to a mental institution, and as far as I know, he's still there today. I'm now 16 years old and changed forever because of what that monster put me through. I've taken jiu-jitsu as well as always carrying a pocket knife with me wherever I go. I consider Mrs. Bennett a savior because if it weren't for her, I most likely wouldn't be alive or would have continued to endure Liam's torture. For what she did, I'll always be thankful to her. I was about 7 to 10 years old at the time of this story and live where I do right now, a lovely green area in London, Chiswick. It's gorgeously lush with greenery and trees, the only clearings being the parking lots 50 yards from my front door. It may be important to note that there's an old person's home in front of us. Now, my hometown isn't typically a crime-ridden city. It's one of those high-class towns. That's why what happened next is so out of the ordinary. It's nighttime and the moon is shining on the somewhat reflective gravel of the parking lot. As I'm preparing for bed and a movie, this taking place in my parents' room, we all collectively hear the rusty wheels of a camper van pull into the open residential parking lot. We look outside because it's a quiet neighborhood and there normally isn't much commotion at this time. It's a glance that lasts a second before we resume our tucking in, that is, until we hear a frail scream and whimper. My parents arch a brow practically in unison and go to the window. Kids are curious, so I venture to the gap between both my parents as they looked out. An old woman was shoved out of the camper van by a burly, small man just inches taller than the elderly woman. He grabs what seems to be a champagne bottle and smashes it above the woman's head. She falls, and he pulls her back up again to repeat perhaps thrice more. My parents were shocked and tried to edge me out of the gap, but I was morbidly curious, yet entirely concerned. Rushing to the adjacent window without a crowd, I looked out to see more of the scene. The man begins to shout quite drunkenly at her and tells her to get lost. She began walking, her head bludgeoned with shards of reflective glass. Her white, silvery hair is stained as she begins trudging to the small alleyway to the other side of my home in the next block. I race to the bedroom window on the other side of my home to keep eyes on her. My parents remained in their room. They still haven't to this day told me why they didn't follow her as I had. I watch her disappear around the corner and then charge to my parents' room. I pull my father's hand and says, "Call the police, Dad." He doesn't answer my exclamation and pulls me to my bed and tucks me in, walking back to his room and to my mother. They closed the door. The camper van had been gone at this point, but I was terrified he'd return. My father locked all the doors and my window, but it still felt scary. Needless to say, I had to stay in my parents' room due to how the incident spilt into my dreams. I asked them a week ago, now being 18, on what happened, but they refused to talk. My dad says he straight up doesn't remember. My mother tells me there was shouting, but no blood. I was adamant in my position. I remember everything vividly. It baffled me because this incident was what solidified my inherent interest in crime, I suppose. My parents downplayed or just don't remember this incident, and I think that's what scares me the most about it. The cloud of amnesia my parents developed. I'm willing to bet my life that this did happen, and when I look at reports or newspaper articles, nothing comes up. Whoever that lady is, I hope she's okay or in a better place. However, the feeling I'm the only one who remembers this vividly is burdeningly scary. I am the eldest of 4. Myself, my brother, and 2 younger sisters. However, my first run-in with my guardian angel happened when there were barely 3 of us. Age 6 years. I feel that it's important to say that I have a condition called Turner syndrome. One of the effects is short stature and a youthful appearance, meaning I was a 6-year-old that gave the visual illusion of being maybe a 4-year-old. I had started 1st grade that year. It was really my first year of school. At that time in my state, kindergarten was optional and preschool was rare. My mom had opted out of kindergarten for me. Because of my age, some of the details are kind of fuzzy, but I'm going to do the best I can. I remember crossing the playground to head home and stepping into the wooded area on the other side. It was a shortcut to get to the trailer park where I lived. Normally, I didn't take this shortcut alone. I would walk with the girl from next door who was in 6th grade. She had gone home sick unexpectedly that day. It had to be late fall because I was wearing my brand new coat. I love that jacket. Memory is such a tricky thing. Some of the bigger details are hard to remember, but I can remember thinking how pretty the changing leaves were as my eyes followed one as it skidded past me on the packed dirt of the ground beneath my feet. I was nervous about the walk home, but didn't feel like I had much of a choice. I didn't know the long way around. I had never walked that way. Unfortunately, another aspect of Turner syndrome causes me to be very dysfunctional when it comes to directions. The way the doctors explain it is that my mind cannot make a map. I can picture where I'm supposed to go, but not how to get there. I am fine if it's a route that I take on a daily basis, but if I skip even a week, it's a toss-up if I can remember the way. This route should have been familiar and shouldn't have been a problem. I walked it 5 days a week and had for months now. I remember staring down the path. Other kids heading that way ran past me, eager to get away from school as quickly as possible. The next thing I remember is being terrified and lost. I had somehow, for some reason, wandered off the well-worn path and into the trees. I don't remember how long I wandered around, but I remember the sun was starting to go down, so about an hour or maybe less. Then I heard his voice as I stood and rubbed my eyes crying. He asked me if I was lost. Looking up, I nodded. He said to follow him. Without a second thought, I did. I have always been very overly cautious and leery around people, especially as a child. The unquestioning way I simply fell into step behind him never made any sense. However, the thing that strikes me as the strangest of all is that he never asked where I lived. I wish that I could truly describe him. I can tell you that I think he wore a tan, leatherish type jacket, blue jeans, was average height, and had short hair. I tell you all of that, but the only thing I swear to is that he was average looking. He didn't take my hand or offer any comforting words. He simply led, with me struggling a bit, trailing a bit behind him. Soon we came to the edge of the tree line, and he smiled and said, "It's that way." I was so shy I couldn't even bring myself to say thank you. I simply nodded my head again, this time smiling and darting between the 2 trees and into the open where the gravel road leads me straight to my trailer. Before I did, though, I turned and looked back. He was gone, just like that. When I got home, Mom immediately demanded to know why I was so late. She scolded that she was to call the police. I blurted out that I had gotten lost, but didn't get any further than that before she suddenly looked at me. "Where's your jacket?" I reached up and patted the top of my head. I'd been wearing a coat like a cape. Not with the arms tied around my neck, but the hood on my head, believing that it would hold on. It was then that I remembered struggling to keep up with the man and how uneven the ground was. There were times I was even stumbling a bit in the effort to keep up with the mystery man. I must have not have noticed when it had fallen. I timidly told my mom that I had lost it. Angrily, she took my hand and was headed back down the route I had taken home to try and find it. It was nowhere. She was furious. She reminded me of how expensive the coat was, and I was heartbroken. I went to sleep that night thinking it had been the worst day of my life. The next morning was Saturday. I got up and got ready to go out and play in the front yard with my younger brother. My mom reminded me not to be out too long, seeing as how I didn't have a coat to wear. We flew out of the front door, but I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting right outside the door somehow was my lost jacket, folded and looking none the worse for wear. I grabbed it, put it on, and ran in to show my mom. She looked confused and of course asked me where I found it. I told her the porch, and she sat silent for a while before making a declaration that one of the other kids must have found it and brought it back. She wasn't convinced, and neither was I. Age 12. We lived in a rental house, had no vehicle, and my mom and her boyfriend were both unemployed. To say that there were financial issues is the understatement of the year. In fact, the utilities had all been disconnected, and we were 2 weeks away from the sheriff showing up to padlock the front door and all of our things along with it. Naturally, my mom had not the slightest idea of where we were going to go or what we might do. That's when my mother's brilliant boyfriend, one of many, had the ingenious idea. You see, we had never really traveled outside of our small county and rarely out of our tiny town. We were a week away from school being out for summer vacation. We weren't exactly surprised when, late that Tuesday afternoon, my mom burst into the living room where we were watching television to announce, yes, I am embarrassed to admit that we were stealing the neighbor's electricity via a drop cord. You guys need to pack a bag, but not very much. We're going across country on an adventure. So, that's what we did. Well, sort of. We did go across the country, but it wasn't much of an adventure. See, said boyfriend owned a small, 2-door Ford Scorpio. This was the mid-'80s. Yeah, I'm old. So mom, boyfriend, 4 kids, and a family friend all pile into this small, cramped space, along with everything they might need to somewhat survive. Camping gear, ER tools, clothes. It wasn't until that night that we learned his plan to finance this little fiasco. Most towns have emergency transit assistance programs in place. This can range from a meal at a shelter with a gift of gas money to move along, emergency food stamps, and a small amount of cash, or a church that will step in. A lot of times, when all else fails, we would find a spot to pull out the camping gear and stay overnight. Those nights were kind of nice, even if it were all those people shoved into what should have been a 4-man tent. We got to run, yell, and scream. We got to be kids. By this time, the novelty of the adventure had started to wear off. Boyfriend did nothing but complain. My brothers snored too loud. We were unbearable when we got wired up on candy, and that was just about all we wanted to eat. I mean, we were 4 young kids stuck in a cramped car at least 16 hours a day, every day. The church is where I saw him this time. We had been directed to this church in the middle of nowhere. It was down a dark dirt road, and we had gotten a bit lost. So by the time we pulled up, it was dark and there were no cars. The car sat parked with headlights shining on this older, out-of-date one-room church. We heard the adults contemplating what to do next. Should we just see if we could find a place to pitch the tents? That's when I looked up and saw a gentleman coming around the side of the building from what we assumed to be the church's living quarters. He walked up to the boyfriend's window and listened as he was given the same rehearsed speech that had worked over and over again so far. Without another word, he moved to face the rear passenger side window. It was rolled down already. The AC in the car didn't work, and it was so hot. The smile on his face was so warm. "How are you tonight?" His question was clearly directed at me. "Fine, thank you." He nodded and mumbled to the boyfriend, "I'll be right back." Moments later, he did return, handing the boyfriend enough money for a tank of gas, a hotel room, and McDonald's. He then stepped back and talked to us again. Looking at my brother, he said, "Snore as loud as you want," and handed us each a full-size candy bar. The adults looked shocked as he turned and simply left back the way he came. I was smiling. As soon as he rounded the side of the church and out of view, I recognized him. It was the man from the woods. Don't ask me how I recognized him, not knowing for sure what he looked like, but I had no doubt it was him. The next day we went back. I guess the boyfriend thought that maybe we could get a bit more out of him. There was someone else there this time, though. This person looked at my mom like she had 3 heads when she asked about the guy from the night before, and if she could speak to him again. He proceeded to say, "There couldn't have been a guy out there at that time of night. The church didn't have any living quarters. In fact, it didn't at the time even have an active congregation. He was just there to take care of the landscaping, I think." Age 24 years. At this time, I worked at a convenience store as a clerk and was trying to figure out what I truly wanted to do with my life. This time, the lack of prosperity and stability was all me. I loved the job, but hated the location of the store. It was a good 30-minute drive from where I lived, and I didn't have a car. And because I know it's going to get brought up, there were no buses that went out that way. All of this meant that for minimum wage, I had to find a ride to and from work every day. To work wasn't as big of a deal. I went in around 4:30 p.m. A ride home was normally trickier. Not nearly as many people are willing to go 30 minutes from downtown to pick you up at almost 1 a.m. It had been one of those days. I still didn't know how I was going to get home. No one could come to grab me, and it was toward the end of the month, so I didn't have a dime for a cab. In fact, I was surrounded by food, but literally starving. I didn't even have the money to buy something to eat. It had been dead all afternoon. I stood behind the counter behind the register thinking about all the side work that I was going to be getting done because I couldn't stop thinking about the ice cream over there in the cooler that I really wanted. I was beyond stressed and more than a little overwhelmed. I was so lost in thought that the door chime almost didn't snap me out of it. Glancing up, I watched him enter. I had a strong feeling of recognition, but I couldn't quite place the face. He walked over to the counter with purpose. He had a peaceful look on his face as he laid down a wad of rolled-up money on the counter. "Get yourself some ice cream," was all he said before turning around and walking out. I stared in disbelief. As soon as I could get my lower jaw up off the floor, I whispered, It can't be." It was the guy from the woods. He didn't look a day older than he had when I was 6 years old. He was wearing the same soft smile as he had worn when I was 12. Walking over, I picked up the roll of money and began counting. There in my hands was enough for an ice cream and a cab ride home. I can't explain it. It doesn't make sense that I can't describe him to anyone, yet the times he has shown up, I had no doubt that it was him. I recognized him. The other more plausible explanations are endless, really, I'm aware of that. However, I have no doubt. Other stories that I have contributed are all my attempts at having a spark of imagination, and this time I assure you, I have had the privilege of meeting my guardian angel 3 times. I am comforted that he was there. That doesn't mean I wasn't left a bit creeped out. I mean, really, can you blame me? As all legends, myths, and creatures of folklore, La Llorona has its origins in ancient beliefs. The Aztecs had a goddess called Quacotl. She was half woman, half snake. It was associated with the soil, fertility, and childbirth, and most important, it was the patron of women who died during childbirth. As the Aztec myth goes, she abandoned a son, another god, on a crossroad, and from time to time she would come back to the site and would cry in regret for her lost son. In a compilation of testimonies taken from natives who lived through and survived the conquest, it appears that some 10 years before the arrival of Spanish conquerors in the capital of the Aztec Empire, during a period of weeks and in the heart of every night, an unknown woman would scream and cry, "Oh, my children, we will be lost. Oh, my children, where will I take you?" She was heard among the streets and canals of the city. The capital was built on top of a lake that doesn't exist anymore. No one dared to get out and see who was screaming so pitifully because of the fear and terror the sounds provoked. This, among other paranormal events, were taken as bad omens of impending doom and, later on, portents of the arrival of the Spanish conquerors. Much of the history of those days were lost, so it is uncertain if this really happened. Some say they are interpretations of the history added later on. Following this, and as often happens when a superior culture conquests another, some of the Aztec cultural remnants got mixed with the new, foreign Spanish one, and during the colonial age, the legend adapted, and the people living in the capital started talking of a woman who late at night, after the curfew, would start screaming and crying for her lost children. People said that a woman with a white dress would walk out of the lake surrounded by very thick fog, a veil covering her face, and would walk around the streets of the city crying and screaming. People used to say that the drunks getting out of the cantinas and bars late at night would encounter the woman. She would talk to them and convince them to walk her home. The man, totally wasted, enchanted by her voice and silhouette, would follow her, hoping for a lucky night. The really lucky ones would notice after a while as they walked together that she was not even touching the ground, instead floating above it or not having feet at all. The man would instantly turn around and run in the opposite direction while the specter would let out a chilling scream that would cure him of alcoholism for the rest of the night. The not-so-lucky would follow her, oblivious to everything, hypnotized, until their feet fell in water, waking them and making them notice that she was leading them to the lake, the woman now floating above the surface of it, turning around, removing the veil of her face to show one of two things: a pure white skull instead of a face with two black holes instead of eyes. The dress now was rotten rags, staring at the now purely sober gentleman. Other tales say that instead of a woman's head, she had a horse head with red glowing eyes. The men would go mad, or if he survived the encounter, he would live to tell the tale and die days after of uncontrollable fever and hallucinations. There was only oral records of these supposed encounters, passed down from parents to children, and far more likely to be a cautionary tale of the wrong life of the alcoholics and that you should behave. Now, there are many recounts and different versions of La Llorona in different towns and cities. It's necessary to clarify there are more than one, but there is a connection between them. Every woman who died during childbirth was adored like a goddess, since their suffering for bringing a life into the world was compared to the death of a warrior in the battlefield, and would go to serve the sun for 4 years before getting back and being reincarnated in the form of a hummingbird. Losing a child was and is horrible to the first mother, who would cry in pain for their loss. The myth devolves so the souls of those who harmed its children, caused its death, would be punished to return and search for them for the rest of eternity, carrying the guilt and suffering of what they did. And here it is where it enters the most spread origin of the Llorona, the woman who drowned their sons in a river out of spite, anger, or madness, most occasions because of a cheating husband. You can find Lloronas in little towns around Mexico. Most of them appear near towns with rivers or lakes on rainy season. Just ask any old person around and you will probably hear a tale or two. We have a room in the basement that my dad uses as a music room. It's the only unfinished room in our house, and I'm not sure why it was never finished. My dad also leaves the door open because it gets really cold in there and he wants the heat to circulate into that room. My bedroom and my bathroom are also in the basement, so I spent 90% of my time down there. It just so happens that my bathroom is right next to the music room too. I have had 3 different experiences where I'm in my bathroom and I hear 3 loud knocks on my door. It's so loud that when I answer the door, I expect one of my parents to be on the other side. There was one time where I was in the shower and I heard 3 loud knocks over the sound of the running water. I yelled, "Hold on," and got out to find that there was nobody at my door. Everyone in my house denies knocking. On occasions, our dogs, we have 2, will go up to the music room entrance and bark at it nonstop. They won't go in, they will just sit there and bark. My dad is very adamant that the music room door be open. It's a rule that everybody knows well in our house. One time I found it closed and everyone denied doing that as well. The only one that uses that room is my dad, and it's his role to keep it open. The last experience I have with that room is one morning, around 6:15 a.m. I was walking out of my bathroom and heard a low growling sound coming from the music room. I stopped to really listen and make sure I wasn't hearing something else, and I was sure the sound couldn't be explained by anything inside the room. I rushed upstairs to get my dad to show him, and when we came back, the sound had stopped. I don't think anyone or anything has died in this house, so I assume it's a ghost attached to an item or potentially one of us. My deceased grandma gave us her keyboard before she passed, and it currently sits in our music room. Other than that, I can't think of anything else. When I was about 15, I went with my best friend's family to Utah to visit his family. My friend, who I'll call Joe, and I were the type of friends where I could walk into his house, even when he was not there, go into their fridge and eat whatever. His family had had me come with them on other vacations before, so I was pretty much adopted into his family. In Utah, we split staying time at his grandparents' house and his aunt and uncle's house. His parents wanted to make sure that we spent time at his grandparents', so that way they felt like we wanted to be there, but their house was pretty boring. The grandparents' house was a stereotypical old person's home. They had nothing to play with, and had a small TV in the basement that had just the basic 10 channels. They didn't even have a DVD player, just a VCR. The area this story takes place is in the basement, so I'll briefly describe it. When you come down the stairs, immediately on your right as you get to the bottom of the stairs is a walk-in closet. That's where they kept all their food storage and other supplies. Opposite the closet door, the basement opens up to a living room with 70s shag orange carpet, and rooms further to the left when you come into the living room. There was nothing about this home that gave off a creepy vibe, and I was not paranoid whatsoever, and nothing happened the first night that would make me afraid to sleep there, but our second night there, something happened. My friend said I could sleep on the couch, and he would sleep on the floor at the base of the couch. We were watching Cool Runnings on VHS, pretty much the only good VHS movie they had, before we went to sleep. When it was over, my friend had already passed out, so I turned the TV off and went to make myself more comfortable on the couch. Before I was about to lay down, I saw out of the corner of my eye this red orb. I turned to look at it, and it just slowly faded away. Now, I didn't really believe in orbs, and I still really don't know what to make of them, but that was really odd to me. I shook it off and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I stirred awake. I was confused as I got up because there was light shining in the living room. I figured someone must have gotten up, and I turned to look. What I saw shook me to my core. I looked up at the direction of the light. It was coming from the walk-in closet. Standing in the doorway of the closet was this solid black mass of a person. I stared at it in horror, trying to make sense of it. The figure had no facial features, but had the distinct outline of a man. After about 5 seconds of staring, frozen at this thing, it turns around and walks further into the closet. At this point, my frozen fear broke, and I practically did a barrel roll onto my friend. "Joe, get up! Get up!" I violently whispered. He stirred awake and, in an irritated voice, asked, What is it? What is it?" I told him that there was something in the closet. Now, Joe doesn't really believe in the paranormal and was probably annoyed that I woke him up. He walked over to the walk-in closet, looked all the way inside, and turned off the light. "Dude, there's nothing there," he said. After this, I spent quite some time still shaking in fear, lying awkwardly close to my best friend because I was scared, and somehow I managed to fall asleep. In the morning, I tried to explain to myself what happened. It was hard for me to admit I was in a dreamlike state because I felt like I was pretty awake from seeing the light. but part of me wanted to believe that's what had happened. I told my experience to the family at breakfast the next day, laughing it off like maybe I was crazy or something. The grandma looked at me and smiled. What she said next still gives me chills. "Oh, you probably did see something. My dad died in the basement of this house. I see him down there sometimes too." My next experience was when I was about 17. Sometimes, especially if I was feeling upset or depressed, I liked to go on walks at night and listen to my loner music. It was kind of therapeutic for me, even though saying this makes me look like a loser. I was on one of those loner walks and taking one of my usual routes, which was through the field of my old elementary school. I liked to walk there sometimes and just sit on the swing set, look at the stars, and try to make sense of life and other things. This field of this school was contained by a wooden fence that had a few exits for kids to walk to the school through from their neighborhood. I was heading towards one of the openings when I looked at where I was headed and saw the strangest thing. Standing about 40 feet from me was a man in a tuxedo and top hat, leaning up against the fence and staring at me with the creepiest smile. When I saw this, I was more weirded out than scared. Why would a dude dressed like this be hanging out at an elementary school at night? I turned off my music to make sure I could hear him if he started to walk toward me or something. I started to head towards one of the other exits and looked down at the ground for a second to avoid his gaze. When I looked up, the man was completely gone. My heart dropped in my stomach. I hadn't heard him move or anything. Even though he was still a little bit off, it would be pretty easy to hear him jump the fence or walk away. After a couple of seconds digesting what just happened, I booked it and ran all the way home in a full sprint. I've gone on walks since and even taken the same path, but I've never seen that happen again. One more experience and we'll call it good. This was when I was about 20. I was serving a mission for my church in South Carolina and Georgia. For this mission, we would walk the streets, knock on doors, and talk to anyone we could about what we believe. I'm sure most of you hearing this are probably annoyed with people like me knocking on your door, but know that we do it because we really believe in our faith, and we believe in sharing that with others. I hope you can at least respect that, even if you are annoyed by it. We were walking the streets in a suburb of Augusta, Georgia, when we ran into this odd dude. He was in his 30s and had a weird skin condition where he had bumps all over his body, kind of like the guy in Black Panther, except not cool looking. As we were talking, he asked us if we could pray over his home. He explained to us that things had been difficult lately. His uncle had been living at his home and he just recently went to prison for ending someone's life, and ever since then, his home had just felt off. People inviting us into their homes happened only a few times each day, so we took every opportunity we could, especially in the hot Georgian summer. As we walked in, I felt that the home was kind of off. It was really dark in there. Thick curtains had blocked the windows and all the lights were turned off. When you walk into the home, you come right into the living room. There's a hallway on the right of the door that leads to some rooms. Then there's this big archway that separates the dining room from the living room. So at the end of this big room of the living room and dining room combined was the back door that had a window on it. This was where the only light source was coming from. We sit on the couches in the living room and the guy starts going off without us being able to get a word in. He starts talking about how he's trying to be a rapper and samples some of his music to us. I don't like rap to begin with, but this was terrible. But to be polite, we told him it was pretty cool. After this, he goes on to explain why he invited us in. He told us that he was happy we were there. Things have been strange in his home lately. He then said something that totally changed the mood. He said, "Yeah, like I said, my uncle went to prison for killing someone. Actually, it happened in this house. The blood of the guy is still stained on the back of the couch you're sitting on." Immediately, my hair stands up and chills run down my spine. I took a glance at the couch, and sure enough, there was blood stains there. I hadn't noticed it before because of how dark it was in there. He continued, "So ever since then, I've seen things out of the corner of my eye, It just felt like there's a negative presence there. After he said this, something that was inhumanly fast went from one side of the room and ran into the kitchen, blocking out the only source of light from the back door for a split second. As if this was a normal occurrence, the guy calmly says, "Like that? Yeah, that's been happening a lot." At this point, my friend and I wanted nothing more than to get out of the house. I quickly said that we will pray over it. I did, and it did feel lighter in there, but still, knowing that we were sitting on that couch, we wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. I quickly gave him a way to contact us, and we got out. I had just turned 19, I'm currently in my 30s, and was trying to live life to the fullest. When I was growing up, my mom was super protective and at times extremely overbearing. I was never allowed to go to typical hangouts that the kids my age would frequent. I would say from a small child to at least 16, I spent most of my weekends indoors or in the confinement of my small upstate New York suburban neighborhood. At 16, I was allowed out on weekends, but only if my brother, who is 3 years older than me, basically babysat me. I would have to tag along with my brother and his friends, who were much older than him. I didn't mind. Getting out of the house and exploring activities at night was a new experience for me, and was a bit liberating not being cooped up in the house. I guess one could say I was a pretty sheltered kid and teenager most of my life. All this comes into play. Fast forward to when I turned 18, my mother finally let me get my driver's permit, and a few weeks later I was able to get my driver's license. I guess she realized at 18 she couldn't keep that much control over my freedom. I would go to work, pick up anyone who needed a ride, and make any excuse not to come home. Having my car meant the absolute ultimate freedom. It wasn't long after this, roughly about a year later, I started to fall into a group of troubled kids. I guess you can say they were the ones society called degenerates and bums. Most of them had a lot of very apparent mental disorders. Couldn't hold any jobs. Most of them had a felony or a run-in with the law. The only consistent thing with them was the copious amounts of random drugs or whatever they could get their hands on that particular night. I fit right in with their little group of misfits, mostly because I was their personal chauffeur the majority of the time. Boy, did that get old real quick. It wasn't long after I started to dabble into drugs myself. I found myself smoking pot almost every night with my new friends. We were the ones literally driving around, drinking beers, smoking, and blasting our music at 2 a.m. and beyond, and not giving a single heck about any authority figures or anything for that matter. There were times where I had to elude the police at very high speed so I didn't get a DUI or my car searched. It became such a rush doing that. I felt certifiably hardcore. Or should I say, a certified idiot in such a short amount of time. It wasn't long after that we started getting into more of the harder stuff. Ecstasy, MDMA, acid, etc. All this leads us up to the morning in question. This event literally changed my life. This shook me to my very core. In literally 1 year, I became a very sheltered teenager to a very cocky, invincible, and drug-infused, naive little idiot. If you have made it this far into my story, sit back and enjoy the chaos I'm about to tell. It was a very foggy, wet, and humid August morning. As I mentioned above, I'm from upstate New York. If you want to get a sense of what upstate New York is like, woods, lots and lots of woods, back roads and creepy winding woodland roads. After coming down from a night of tripping off a psilocybin, or what people like to call magic mushrooms, my friends, for the sake of the story, I shall name them Dave and Ray. Dave was a very tall and lanky and slightly balding red-headed man. He was what I called the fox alpha of the group. He was aggressive and intimidating and just all around kind of an idiot. Ray, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He was a genuinely nice guy, average build and the pretty boy of the group. His problem was always getting arrested for petty stuff, violating his probation and small things like that. This also comes into play as to why he couldn't get the authorities involved. So at about 7 a.m., just as the sun is starting to rise, All of us have now been up all night and coming down from the excessive tripping from the mushrooms that same night. If anyone who hasn't done magic mushrooms, the day after is brutal. Your brain is literally running on autopilot. Common sense apparently is non-existent. You're literally in a zombified-like state. As I'm driving, none of my friends or I are conversating. It was a pretty quiet ride, which is to be expected after having a crazy out-of-your-mind experience that same night. We were all just puffing on our cigarettes and just taking in the morning light. After about an hour of driving on the deeply wooded road and with no destination plan out, I see Dave perk up in the corner of my eye in the passenger seat. He taps my shoulder excitedly and says, "Hey man, look over there. There's a random girl walking. Let's give her a ride." Me, being generous by nature, I thought there wouldn't be any harm honestly seeing if this girl needs a ride or needs help. As I approached her, I slowed my car down on the quiet, heavily wooded road. We had not seen a single car or even a house in the last 20 minutes, so I wasn't in any real harm or danger slowing my car down. At first glance of this girl, she seemed young but also mature looking, like a face that has been through some hardships. She appeared to be in her early to mid-20s, amber-colored hair that was backlit by the sun and, oddly enough, dressed kind of casual, like someone would dress going to brunch or a nice restaurant. Dave rolls down the window and says, "Hey there, good morning. My friends and I saw you walking, and we wanted to know if maybe you needed a ride somewhere." She then turned her body towards my car, and I then saw an 8-inch wooden and metal cross with Jesus crucified dangling around her neck. I thought to myself, of all the people wandering in the woods, it's a freaking Bible pusher. Seeing how I saw the humor in the situation, I knew any chance of my friend hooking up with her dramatically went down. Just then, in an excited tone, she squeals with this almost adorable but sinister grin on her face and says, "God bless you, gentlemen. I asked the good Lord to turn my tired legs into wheels, and He must have sent you handsome men to the rescue. God is good." Without any hesitation, she opens my back passenger door and sits directly next to my friend Ray. He is awkward and shy around her right off the bat. As I put my car into drive, I adjusted my rearview mirror so it's fixated on her face. I ask her, "Where do you need to go?" She says, "If you gentlemen wouldn't mind, you can bring me in my house. I would be most gracious." I said, "No problem. Just let me know where to go, seeing that I don't really have any idea where I am." Keep in mind, this is way before GPS and Google Maps. I just had a terrible flip phone with no service. With the rearview mirror directly fixated on her eyes with a now dark and sinister expression on her face, she asks, "You guys are so silly. Does anyone know where you even are?" Seeing how this is an oddly unnerving question, almost in unison, my friends say, "No?" And I am the odd one out saying yes, and then going along with my friends saying, "Well, no." She excitedly says, "You guys must be really hungry. When we get to the house, y'all can come in and I'll fix you something good to eat." Just then my stomach churns and makes this internal groaning sound. When you're so hungry, anything sounds good. I look directly at her and say, yeah, we'll see." She then throws an evil scorn my way and is not directly looking at me through my rearview mirror. I'm not going to lie, it was extremely unnerving. After about 20 minutes of going down random roads and just endless woods, she yells, "Okay, in about 20 feet my driveway is coming up. It's very hidden, and I'm warning you guys, it's at least a quarter-mile long." As I approached her dirt driveway, the trees were so old and dense it almost acted like a complete sunblocker. It was so dark I had to put my high beams on. Let me tell you, she wasn't kidding when she said her driveway was long. I was honestly surprised to find this random beautiful 2-story house literally in the middle of the woods. As I parked my car, the first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet it was. I asked her, do you live here by yourself? Are we going to wake anyone up? She said, oh, my mom isn't home. She went to early mass. Please, come in. With the thought of food in my head, my stomach was louder than the thoughts in my head to leave, and we all started following to her front door. Once she opened her door, she said for us to sit down in the table outside the kitchen with the stools. Looking around her house, it looks like it hasn't been updated since the 70s. Very Brady Bunch-esque. It literally felt like I was in a movie studio set and they precisely nailed the 1970s down to the T. But anyways, she then busted out a family-sized version of macaroni and cheese and placed it in the oven. She said, I am sorry. I wasn't expecting any guests. I hope this is enough for you guys. It should be ready in about 30 to 45 minutes. For the next half hour, we tried to make small talk with her. For some reason, I must have rubbed her the wrong way, but she would randomly glance over at me and just not say a word. Just literally look at me for 2 to 3 minutes straight without blinking and just give me this cold, expressionless face. About 40 minutes go by and she asks us, how old are you guys? We say our ages, 19, 20. She then says creepily, I bet you guys would love some wine. Excitedly we all say, yeah, that would be awesome. Just then she goes inside her fridge, and about 10 to 15 seconds later she pulls out a labelless glass craft of wine and pours us each a glass. I didn't really question at the time why she wasn't enjoying a glass of wine, but then again it was pretty early in the morning. After each of us finish a glass of wine each without asking or a pause, she fills up our glasses and keeps topping us off. After the buzzer alarm goes off on the stove, she pulls out this amazing-looking pan of frozen mac and cheese, but it actually doesn't look half that bad. About mid-plate, I felt this immediate uneasy feeling in my body. I put it off as the wine and the no sleep and it being about 8-something a.m. in the morning. Just then, in the corner of my eye, I see this car pull in the driveway. It's her mother. It dawned on me the awkwardness of the situation that we are in, and I'm not sure how this is going to play out. As the mother gets out of her car, she directly looks at my car and realizes she now has some uninvited guests in her house at 8 a.m. I very fastly chugged the second glass of wine and said, Hey, I think your mom is home. Can I have another glass real quick? She has this awkward but mysterious grin on her face and says, Of course you can. Drink up quick and don't waste it. Just as she finished pouring my glass, her mom aggressively opens the door and looks at her daughter and says, Now what is going on in my house? She furiously says. The daughter then says, Mother, this is no way to act in front of our new guests. The mother is scanning us fiercely, and I awkwardly bury my face in the glass of wine, and the first thing she does is throw her purse down and comes over to us and immediately takes away the wine glasses from us and just throws them all in the sink. When she took the glasses away, I was mid-sip. As the glasses smash into pieces and tiny projectiles in the sink, she looks at her daughter and says, What are you thinking? I told you to never give anyone that wine. She hysterically yells at her daughter. The daughter then says, But, Mother, our guests were thirsty. After the mother and daughter continued to fight, I tried innocently to intervene. I said, Ma'am, I know how this might look, but let me explain. My friends and I had seen your daughter walking on a sketchy road and offered her a ride. Your daughter was nice enough to offer us a bite to eat, and we're going to head out after. The mother looks at me and says, I want you and your friends out of my house now. She starts shrieking. Just then the daughter pulls the mom into another room and they're going at it. I mean, they are just yelling at each other. I hear things like, We just got away with... And also, And you give them that wine? Are you crazy? While trying to eavesdrop and also look at my friend and start mouthing, We gotta go now. My friends look at me equally scared and Ray says, Bro, I want to get out of here, but I can't feel my legs. I think they're asleep. My other friend, Dave, says, Bro, I think she put something in that wine. My whole body's numb. This wasn't just wine. I guess me being bigger in size and more meat on me, I had only felt a moderate amount of numbness. It was almost like the feeling you get when you're on the toilet doing your business, and you're 30 minutes deep in Reddit stories and you try to get up off the toilet and you have to wait for the blood to return back to your leg to regain feeling. Kind of like that. But the feeling didn't immediately come back. If anything, my body felt like it was starting to get to early stages of paralysis. I knew then that if we didn't leave, all three of us would be completely immobilized. With the biggest thrust and everything I had, I was about to pick myself up. My friend Dave was also able to get himself up as well, but Ray was unable. So Dave and me reached and grabbed his pant leg above the knee and carried him off the stool. It was this moment I realized the gravity of the situation. This was never about the wine. The mom was not only upset about the wine, something more sinister was going on. This went from an awkward situation to a legit horror movie plot. All of a sudden, the mom and daughter stopped yelling at each other because I'm guessing they heard the stools being moved around and the commotion going on as we were trying to leave. And the daughter flies down the flight of stairs and sees us heading out, literally carrying our friend, and angrily says, "Now where do you think you're going?" This seemingly soft-spoken 8-inch wooden cross-wearing child of God suddenly became demonic real quick. I said, we're just getting some fresh air and maybe have a cigarette." She then says furiously, "Y'all can't leave. I haven't even showed you the best part. You can't leave." She cries out. Just then she goes in front of us and is now blocking the front door. This 120-pound female thinks she's going to stop my 250-pound big frame. I told her, "Ma'am, please get out of our way. We just want to leave." She then laughs in a way I never saw coming and says, "You fools. Once you came in, you were never going to leave. This is God's plan." I had the most epic, oh no, rage in me build up. I had one more burst of energy left in me, and before she could even react, I dropped my friend Ray and did an Adam Sandler and the Waterboy charge at her, instantly crushing her against the door. We both fall to the ground. I tell my friend Dave to get him and Ray to the car while I keep this now crazy lunatic at bay. I would never in a million years hurt a female, but the gloves were off. My heart was pounding in my chest as more of this poisoned wine was now coursing through my veins. I can feel my body just wanting to collapse, but adrenaline is some crazy stuff, man. As I'm rolling with her on the ground in her living room, she's shrieking like some crazed banshee and is trying to claw my face. I was able to get in a few shots that seemed to stun her and attempted to get myself back up and in my car to get out of this horror freak show. As I'm trying to leave her, her mom is screaming at her saying, "Cassandra, just let them go, let them go." The daughter said in a snarling kind of voice, "No, I want him. The others can leave." As I'm now on my feet, she was trying to pull me back inside from the open door. Back into her messed up, twisted, Brady Bunch-looking house. Under normal circumstances, she wouldn't have been able to get the upper hand on me, but I can feel my numbed body actually get manipulated back inside. The only thing I can do at this point is to grab this weird, black-looking globe paperweight that is on this retro-looking shelf with a heavy whack and came down hard on her head. I honestly just wanted to stun her, but I guess it wasn't enough. She was still proceeding to pull me back inside, and I raised my arm above my head and came down like Thor has briefly taken over my body. She stops trying to pull me inside, and almost immediately this fountain of blood just pours from her head. She looks at me extremely stunned, and with her teeth now stained in blood, she gasps, "This was God's will." And I said, "No, you're just freaking nuts." And she collapses almost immediately after that. I fly down her outside staircase, fumble around to get to my car and get the guys together. My friends jump in the car, and within a few seconds, I'm leaving this crazy woman's driveway and Just drive until I recognize where I am. Now, I could end the story here, but there is an ending. After we got out of that horrible situation, we all go to the safest spot we know, our nightly hangout spot. A very secured spot near the river where we all go to get away from the world. We all end up passing out in my car. Whether it's from the sleep deprivation or the spiked wine, we easily were passed out for at least 14 hours. Just then, we were awoken by a knock from outside my car. I'm literally laying in a pool of my own sweat. My heart is thumping because I'm thinking it's the crazy girl and she found us. Just then, my car door opens, only to reveal it's my other friend, Sean. Sean looks at us and says, "Dude, none of you guys picked up your phones like you normally do. So I just figured you guys are down here by the river," he says, and then takes a better look at us and says, "Jeez, fellas, you guys look terrible. Yo, I don't mean to scare you guys, but come outside. I'll get a fire going and pack a bowl." After we mentally gathered ourselves, we made our way to the roaring fire. Its warm glow gave me a little comfort, and smoking helped me relax. A good 30 minutes go by and none of us had spoken a word, and then Sean breaks the silence and says, "Alright guys, what's going on? Why are you all acting strange?" My friend Ray starts saying in almost a broken sentence, almost at the verge of crying, says, "We gave this girl a ride. The wine... Something was in the wine. I couldn't walk." Sean looks at us and says, "What are y'all talking about?" I said in an aggressive-like tone, "Listen, we picked up this crazy little idiot on the side of the road, went back to her house, she gave us some wine with something in it. Her mom comes home, everything goes to chaos. I've literally barely got out." He starts looking at all of us nervously and asks where this was, and we respond. He starts to visually get upset. "Was her name Cassandra?" Since I was the only one who had heard her name, I go to him and say, "Now how did you know that?" He looks at the fire and a lump forms in his throat. "I used to live next to her, one driveway over. I was 8 and she was 15. She would terrorize me. She would try to get me to do things to her. Her mom found out. She told her mom I was the one being weird, and a few years later, she took my cat and took out all his organs and laid them out in my backyard for me to see. My parents thought it was coyotes. She also poisoned my dog. He came in one night throwing up blood, and when I was 12, she tried to have her way with me. I got home from school and she tried to get in my house, and that's when I took my father's shotgun and smacked her in the head with the butt of it. We moved a few weeks later. She's absolutely insane." I say to him, "Sean, this girl had an 8-inch cross around her neck. What is that about?" He paused, sighs, and takes a deep breath. "Guys, when you saw her this morning, she was walking to go visit her brother." "That's random, so what?" He responds, "You don't understand. Her brother's in the prison the next town over. They found 2 bodies at their house. They were murdered, poisoned, I think. Her brother took the fall for his sister and is serving 2 life sentences." You want to know why she wears the cross? Because the devil comes in many different disguises. To this day, that comment resonates in my brain. I'm not religious, but it does make sense. To the crazy woman and her mother in upstate New York, I hope justice finds its way to you. My parents have traveled for work my whole life. We live in Illinois on a farm with my grandparents, so when I was younger, I would stay with my grandparents while my mom and dad were out of state working. The summer between 8th grade and freshman year, I went to spend about half my break with my parents in Iowa while they were working. My mom had to drive me back to Illinois so my biological dad could come get me for the second half of summer. It happened to be Friday the 13th when my mom was able to take off of work to bring me home. Other than some massive flooding in her area of Iowa, the trip went fine until we hit Illinois and the sun went down. The first thing was passing a cemetery that had 10-foot-tall chain-link fences around it with chicken wire over the top, and a sign on the padlocked gates reading, "Closed from dusk till dawn." Right across from this cemetery was a campground called Rest in Peace Campground. My mom and I made some jokes about vampires because what else do you do when met with such weirdness? The second weird thing, the bright moon was quickly blacked out with clouds, so my mom decided to call a friend of hers near our home to let her know where we were, just in case. And before she could say more than 3 words, we both completely lost cell signal. As we're driving, my mom tells me we're pretty close to a maximum security prison as a fun fact and says to keep an eye out for signs that say, "Do not pick up hitchhikers." The signs are there as a precaution on the off chance an inmate is able to somehow escape custody. The third weird thing, I don't notice any of these signs for about 10 miles and point it out to my mom. She says we may not be close enough yet, but just keep looking for them, which I do. As I'm looking eagerly from my window for any of these signs, I noticed a woman's 6-inch high heel on the side of the road. About 3 miles down, I notice a pair of panties that are ripped in half from the sides. Another 2 miles, I see a white coat splattered in something dark in a ditch. I don't immediately point these out to my mom because I'm confused about these items and confused about why I still haven't seen any of the signs, even though it's been about 30 minutes since my mom told me about them. Finally, we get back home and I tell my mom that there weren't any of the hitchhiker signs on the side of the road and start telling her about the odd articles of clothing I saw. My mom's jaw drops and she tells me that on her side of the road, she saw a 6-inch woman's high heel, a bra, and what was either a miniskirt or a tube top strewn randomly about. We were both left to wonder what the deal was with the clothes and why the signs weren't there, bouncing worst-case scenarios off of each other, but ultimately decided we wouldn't talk about it anymore because no one would ever believe us. Too many weird things on what happened to be Friday the 13th makes for a highly unbelievable story. I thought I dreamed it once, so I brought it up to my mom about 2 years ago, so I was 23, and she remembered every single detail and still didn't have any answers. I'm 25, female, and currently living in my mom's house with my fiancé and daughter. My parents are out of town and normally I have to spend the week before they come home deep cleaning their home after it's left empty for months at a time, so we agreed collectively that I'll keep her home lived in until her return. The house is in the middle of nowhere on a farm, only neighbor being my grandma who lives on the same farm and was at work when this happened. My fiancé works the closing shift at his job and gets home normally between midnight and 1 a.m. One night about 2 weeks ago, he called to let me know he was running a bit late but on his way. About 10 minutes later, I hear his car, which has a very distinct sound because of the exhaust system, about a half-mile down the road. I hear it pull into the front driveway, engine cut off, door close, my dad's dog starts going crazy, and then the front door opens and closes. My fiancé doesn't immediately come into the bedroom, which I don't think anything of because sometimes he goes straight to the bathroom to shower and change before coming to greet me. When I start wondering what's going on because I don't hear the shower, I hear his car about a half-mile down the road, pull into the front driveway, engine cut off, door close, dog does not go crazy, front door opens and closes and my fiancé walks to the bedroom. I looked at him confused and asked if he got home 10 minutes ago, then left for some reason. He was like, no, definitely not. Why? So I explained the situation and he freaks out and starts searching the house, then locks all 3 of the doors to the outside. I make him a copy of my house key and start locking the doors every night until last Thursday. My grandma was supposed to come get my dad's dog since my fiancé, daughter, and I were leaving that night for Pennsylvania to see my parents for the weekend, so I left the door unlocked. I was laying down trying to nap when I hear the front door open then slam closed, and assume it's my grandma coming for the dog, so I roll over and try more to nap. 5 minutes later, the dog comes to the bedroom and gets under the bed, so I immediately call my fiancé and tell him what's going on. He says he's still in town about 15 minutes away, so I immediately call my grandma, who doesn't answer, and text my cousin, who said earlier in the day he might stop by. My cousin said he was at his house 45 minutes from where I live, so I text my fiancé and explain that grandma didn't answer and cousin was at his house. 10 minutes later, my fiancé and his uncle pull up and start searching the house and our property, again finding no one, and I'm almost in tears. I have no idea who's coming into my house or how they're getting out, or if someone is just opening then closing my front door without coming in at all. But it's unsettling, to say the least, especially considering some other odd things that have happened recently but aren't necessarily noteworthy on their own.
Last week, after a long, hard-fought battle with cancer, my grandfather passed away in his sleep. We didn't always have the best relationship. By the time I was 16, I was smoking weed and growing my hair long. By the time he was 16, he'd joined the U.S. Navy and was sailing out to the South Pacific on an aircraft carrier. Needless to say, we didn't understand each other for a long, long time, but over the past few years we'd grown much closer. I guess because, as I grew older, I'd squared myself away and, in turn, he'd become a little softer, a little warmer in his old age. I'd developed somewhat of an interest in military history, so as a result, we'd spend many an hour emptying beer bottles as I coaxed one story after another from him. By the time he died, we were talking pretty much every day, mostly by phone, but it became somewhat of a daily highlight for me. Naturally, when my cousin called one Saturday morning to tell me that he had slipped away during the night, I was heartbroken. I simply thanked her for calling, hung up the phone, then sat down on my old coffee-stained couch, weeping uncontrollably. Not so much tears of loss or grief, but tears of joy. Tears of thanks that I was lucky enough to build a relationship with him, even for a short time, long after I thought it was far too late to do so. A week or two after his funeral, the same cousin called again to inform me that she and her husband had discovered an old footlocker in my grandfather's attic. According to them, it was filled with old naval memorabilia, photos, journals, and souvenirs of his time in the Pacific theater of World War II. I got into my car and drove over to their house immediately, only to find that the footlocker in question was securely sealed with a rusty old padlock. My cousins confessed to not really knowing what was inside, but we agreed that the worn old U.S. Navy stencil made for an easy guess. The only thing to do now was to find a way to remove that lock. When I finally convinced a mechanic friend of mine to drive over with his pair of big, heavy bolt cutters, we spent an hour or so poring over my grandfather's effects. The photos. My God, those photos of him in his teenage years. He looked just like me. I mean, it was like looking into a sepia-toned mirror, like a version of me from some alternate dimension. By the time my friend bid farewell and drove home, I had a solid lump in my throat. If only my grandfather and I could have reviewed the footlocker's contents together. If only we'd had a little more time. Just a little more. It was later that evening, while polishing off a bottle of his favorite variety of Navy rum, that I came across a small, leather-bound journal hidden in the bottom of the footlocker. Placed neatly on top of it was an old, paper ID card, the flimsy kind with faded ink that was distributed across the services during a time of extreme scarcity. The ID card depicted a logo of sorts, with both English and Japanese characters visible on it. The English characters read, ABCC, all caps. Confused, I hammered the acronym into Google, wondering why I'd never heard him mention such an organization before. It didn't take long for me to work out why. The letters stood for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. My grandfather was barely out of his teenage years when the Second World War ended. It was without a doubt his favorite story to tell, of his time in the Navy, when he and his shipmates had gathered around the wireless radio to hear the news of the Japanese surrender. He said he'd never seen anyone so happy in all his life, that all the college football touchdowns and lottery winners he'd seen couldn't hold a candle to the kind of happiness he'd seen on his friends' faces. They were going home. Only they didn't go home. Not for years. I always assumed that my grandfather was just a regular part of the occupation forces that stayed around in the Japanese islands during the aftermath of the surrender. But I was wrong. He was a part of something uniquely horrifying in the history of warfare. Formed shortly after the war by President Truman, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission was intended to merely observe, but not to treat, the effects the bombs had on any survivors. Observe and report. Don't try to alleviate suffering. Just observe and report. The thought just sent a chill through me. I opened the journal and began to read. December 5th, 1946. 17 miles offshore mainland Japan. We're due to depart for the city of Hiroshima any day now. Captain Rabant says it'll be dirty work, but it won't just be counting bodies. He says the world has never seen a weapon like this before, that nobody really knows exactly what happened in Hiroshima. This has us all very excited to see the damage. The crew's mostly in agreement that the Japanese deserved what they got. Lots of guys say this is payback for Pearl Harbor, that they're reaping the whirlwind, whatever that means. Wrote home to Mom. Her and Pop say they're real proud of me. My grandfather's writing drifted off onto thoughts of home, and I found myself skimming the pages until the next mention of Hiroshima. Why hadn't my grandfather mentioned this before? It's not like he could have forgotten that he was part of an event that shaped human history, an event which birthed a new age of terrifying atomic warfare. I found the next relevant entry and continued reading. December 14th, 1946. Hiroshima City. We patrolled into the city for the first time today. None of us believed that a single bomb could wreak such devastation. Command made us wear gas masks and thick rubber clothing. It made us look like monsters. But when we saw what our government had done to the city, even in light of Japanese atrocities, we felt like monsters too. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Whenever the roaring winds died down, we were greeted with the most hideous stillness any of us had ever experienced. Years of churning engines and booming ships' guns had left us unaccustomed to such a lack of noise, and it disturbed us greatly. No city should ever be so quiet, but it wasn't really a city anymore. It was a dead city. We were walking through a great stone corpse, a concrete cadaver whose bones towered above us at every turn. Yet that's not the thing that stuck with me. What gives me the shakes are the shadows, burned onto the crumbling brick walls. Those shadows are all that's left of people, burned into my memory like they burned that morning. Only when I stared dumbfounded at one particular human shape, the perfect outline of a once living person, I swear I saw it shift. Not by much, but I swear I saw the shape's head twist a little as I looked. It wasn't just me looking at that haunting charcoal black shape. It was looking back at me too. I finished off the glass of rum in one gulp, feeling the chemical warmth of the alcohol spreading through my guts with a shudder. It was no wonder he never mentioned the things he'd seen in Japan. They were the terrified delusions of a frightened young man. Maybe he just burned out, and the things he had seen were manifestations of years of suffering under such unnatural stresses. I found myself reading on before I could consider it any further. December 18th, 1946, Hiroshima City. We ventured deeper into the city today, closer toward the epicenter of the blast. It was worse, much worse than our first visit. The bodies. God help us. The bodies were beyond counting. In some places it was hard to tell where each dead Japanese ended, and the next one began. One carcass of a larger building had what looked like a patchwork quilt of burnt bodies carpeting its ground floor. It reminded me of a painting I once saw by that Spanish guy, Picasso. I forget the name of it. Just inhuman-looking figures piled on top of one another, twisted, broken, and charred. What did we do here? Our patrol stopped when we encountered a deep pit of bubbling black sludge. Steam rose from it. I could feel the heat through my protective gear, and we dared not get any closer. The wind died down for a moment, bringing back that awful silence when we heard it. Moaning, a deep, muffled groan that seemed to vibrate from the black sludge itself. A portion of the sludge bubbled up, forming a loose structure for the briefest of time. It almost looked like a hand, like fingers reaching up from the stinking mass of tar. Then it was gone again. One of the men pointed, emitting his own muted cries of terror as another shape bubbled up from the black sludge, before melting back into itself. A face, a clear human face, empty eye sockets, a screaming maw. When we got back, I asked my friend Bill if he saw it too. He said no, and anyone who thinks they did needs to have their head examined. None of us have talked about it since. As long as I knew my grandfather, he'd always mocked my love of horror stories. Silly tales for kids and dopes, he told me. There are much scarier things in real life. I had no idea he was talking from experience. It was getting late. I had to work early the next morning, but I poured myself another glass of strong, dark rum and continued to read. December 18th, 1946. Hiroshima City. Today was our last patrol, and we're all glad for it. The closer we ventured into the city, the more horrific were the things we saw. 2 sailors had to be taken to psych evaluation after what we encountered the last time. The rest of us are in silent agreement not to talk about it, before the same thing happens to us. But after today, I'm sure that number is going to be much higher. A lieutenant had us shoot a pack of Japanese dogs that had become feral due to lack of order in the city. On all fours, they bounded out of some of the ruins in front of us, howling and barking as they limped along. We opened up on them with our carbines, putting each one out of its misery without so much as a second thought. They were different though, these ferals. One man said it was the effect of the poison that the atomic bomb releases when it explodes. Some kind of invisible toxin that floats around in the air and ruins whatever it touches. It had a horrible effect on Hiroshima's dogs, or at least, that's what we told ourselves. When we got closer and had a good look at what we had just killed, we started to doubt that these things used to be dogs at all. They were so misshapen, hairless with mottled skin. Wild dogs. That was the official explanation during our post-mission briefing. Wild dogs that had suffered the effects of atomic poisoning. But I know different. We all know different. Through clumped black fur, matted with pus and blood, I saw something. Something familiar that seemed to shine out from beneath piles of burned, swollen skin. Dogs don't wear gold watches. Dogs don't wear rings. Trauma, that's all this is. A young man suffering from post-traumatic stress who couldn't quite compute the kind of destruction he was seeing. I couldn't blame him. Lord knows how I would have reacted if I was in his boots. I couldn't tear myself away. December 19th, 1946. USS Cabot. My buddy Bill told me a story today. It was his first visit to Hiroshima. We call it the Dead City now. He said it was raining when their landing craft docked, that the raindrops fell heavy, fat and black with dirt and oil. The black rain collected on the goggles of his mask, obscuring his vision until they could be properly cleaned. He said other things fell from the sky too, collecting on his protective gear, strands of hair, the odd fingernail, scraps of clothing. I never saw Bill cry before, even when we lost Jack Holmes to that Japanese kamikaze pilot, but he cried today. He cried when he told me about the kindergarten, how they found kids' bodies, all lined up, each with a tiny skull fracture. They, like the dogs, were changed in ways that he couldn't explain or unsee. Extra eyes, no eyes at all, extra limbs. heads splitting and duplicating. He cried when he described how their teacher, a charred mess of black encrusted skin, had emerged from the ruins and begged them to kill her. He cried when he told me how she knelt before him and pulled the barrel of his carbine to her forehead. And he cried when he told me how he pulled the trigger. Enough, I thought, and slammed the journal shut, putting it back in the bottom of my grandfather's footlocker before covering it up with other items, hiding it, just as he had done from the world, from myself. I haven't looked at it since. I can't bring myself to read anymore. I haven't looked at it since. I can't bring myself to read anymore. He'd spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he'd seen in the dead city, and there I was filling my head with it all. I tried to cry. I tried to let it all out, but as I thought about his friend Bill, how he'd put that poor school teacher out of her misery, I couldn't cry. I didn't deserve to. I visited my grandfather's grave this morning, planting a little stars and stripes into the soil above him. I'm so proud to call him my grandpa, and I think for a while, towards the end, he was proud to call me his grandson. It was painful, but I found myself feeling glad that he'd finally found an escape from the terrors that visited him, terrors of which he never spoke. He deserved peace, and the things he'd seen couldn't reach him anymore. But it hurt that neither could I. Yet when I looked in passing at the gravestone next to his, I saw the first name and understood why he insisted on being laid to rest in this particular plot. Bill, it said. They had spent the war next to each other, and now they would spend eternity next to each other. I realized the bond that formed between men when faced with such unspeakable horror, an unbreakable bond of comradeship. The tears had no trouble flowing then. Rest in peace, Grandpa. My name is Dr. Benjamin Kelly, and I'm a 31-year-old professor of primatology at the University of Manchester in northern England. Late last year, my colleagues and I traveled to Africa on a research assignment in a place called Western Kigoma, a wild area of Tanzania that is home to a number of chimpanzee communities. We went in search of study and enlightenment, but all we found in the deep, dark jungles of Africa was fear, horror, and death. All but 2 of our research team lost their lives in ways almost too horrific to recall. I wish I could forget the blind terror we experienced there. Every day I try to come to terms with the ghastly things we heard and saw, but I cannot. So instead, I will tell you. Gombe National Park is accessible only by boat, sandwiched between a range of steep, mountainous terrain and the gargantuan blue waters of Lake Tanganyika. The park's geographical isolation has led to an interesting development in the flora and fauna. It is the effects of these developments on the thriving chimp population that our small research team set out to study, loading our belongings into a small fishing vessel as the rising African sun turned the dawn sky a shade of blood orange. We sailed north for a few hours before we finally laid eyes on Gombe itself, a towering mountain crescent surrounding an area of dense, green vegetation. Landing on the shore there, unloading our gear onto the golden sands, it felt like something out of a Jurassic Park movie. The unfamiliar songs of strange tropical birds emanated from the jungle, merging with the gentle lapping of water against the shoreline. The verdure looked virtually impenetrable, yet this was to be our home for more than a month. The sense of adventure was palpable. For some of us, this would be the crowning moment of our academic careers. It wasn't long before we met the chimps. Through the thick, lush green of the rainforest, we heard them before we saw them. High-pitched screeches and deep, guttural hoots echoed off the dense canopy, yet we never saw one clearly. They darted among the treetops, a rustle of branches and leaves the only thing that gave away their positions. They were like ghosts. Then, after an hour of exhausting walking through the sweltering jungle, They were suddenly right in front of us. An entire chimpanzee community of around 30 individuals was spread out before the team, playing, grooming, and grazing on fruit and insects. Despite many years of academic toil, I had never actually been this close to a community of wild chimps before. It almost brought me to tears. My first close encounter was with a chimp that our Tanzanian guides named Farida. She was younger and a great deal more curious than the others in her group, so I was not entirely surprised when she ambled up to me as I was having lunch. She studied me for a moment, sniffing the air and eyeing up the fruit and nuts cereal bar I was eating. She then pouted, gently rocking back and forth among the fallen leaves. Chimps use body language to communicate. Farida's pout meant she was asking me for some of my food. She was asking me to share. My heart was almost in my throat by the time I had broken off a small piece and held it out for her to take. This was a dream come true. She took the piece of food, softly hooting a kind of thank you as she began to eat. We were building a relationship with the community. They were beginning to trust us. The trip was going well, but a huge roadblock in our assessments of the community was the reluctance of the alpha male to accept us. His name was Akinda. Akinda looked different to the rest of the chimps. Instead of the usual jet black uniformity, the hair on Akinda's body was almost steel gray. He was brawny and balding with a white muzzle, his body hair missing in patches that revealed deep scarring, evidence of the countless and fruitless occasions on which his leadership was contested. But it was the alpha's eyes that made the real impression on me. Most chimps' eye color ranges from a light golden brown to a deep, muddy ochre, but Akinda's were an almost fiery orange that seemed to glow from his orbital sockets. When he looked at you, you felt it. It was about a week into our search assignment that things began to turn sour. One of the chimps had suddenly become fatally ill. Our guide suspected that it had eaten something poisonous or been bitten by a particularly nasty insect. It was never clear just what killed the poor thing, but one thing became worryingly clear. Akinda blamed us. One by one, the small group of chimps that interacted with us regularly began to shy away from us. A group of males began to almost patrol near us, venturing back and forth to make aggressive displays designed to keep us at bay. Akinda always watched from a distance, his fiery, incandescent eyes glaring at us as he watched our every move. He wanted to make one thing clear: we were no longer welcome. Then, early one morning, one of the guards rushed into our camp, breathlessly commanding us to follow him. By the time we had rushed through the bush towards the chimps, they were already screeching and screaming with an intensity and volume that hurt my ears and had the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Akinda was circling a smaller male chimp, glaring at it with his long, sharp canine teeth bared. In the smaller chimp's hand was a piece of my cereal bar, a piece I had given him just before we had headed back to camp the previous evening. Silently, we watched in horror as the huge, powerful alpha leapt onto the terrified, smaller chimp, clasping his hands around the lesser thing's skull. It struggled and thrashed, but it was useless. Akinda's huge muscles flexed, and we heard the sickening crack as he crushed the smaller chimp's skull in his grip. Blood and brains seeped through the cracks in his huge black fingers as they trembled with raw, animalistic strength. The chimp's screaming somehow grew even louder as the entire community seemed to lose their collective minds. Some looked visibly distraught, tearing at the hair on their bodies and holding their heads in their hands, while others seemed to celebrate the murder, encouraging Akinda by throwing their arms around him in a gesture of submission. Akinda shrugged off the affection, pounding his fists into the small piece of the cereal bar, taking out all the rage and contempt he seemed to feel for outsiders, for humans. Suddenly, Farida came dashing through the bushes to me, her mouth hanging agape in a primate display of fear. yet her eyes were so full of fear and distress that it required no interspecies translation. "Run," they seemed to beg us. "Run for your lives." But then, the rest of the community had noticed us hiding in the foliage. The younger males that were loyal to Akinda began to confront us, howling and pounding their fists against the jungle floor in displays of raw aggression that leave me shuddering to recall. I remember the fear in Farida's golden brown eyes. Run. Run fast. And run we did. We raced through the jungle, pursued relentlessly by Akinda's loyal followers. But they were faster than us, more agile. We were clumsy, afraid, and far, far from home. We didn't stand a chance. Out of around 10 team members, I found myself running with a group of 3, one of which was a portly researcher from Boston. I will never, ever forget his screams as the chimps descended on him. One seemed to dive onto him from out of nowhere, a perfectly timed display of violent athleticism that sent our colleague crashing into the dirt and fallen leaves with a grunt. 2 more chimps materialized from the thick jungle flora, pouncing on our downed team member with terrifying speed. Predators seek to kill quickly and efficiently, but these chimps were not hunting for food. They did not wish to kill efficiently. They wanted only to inflict pain. They only sought vengeance for our supposed transgressions. They sought to punish us. The chimps began by breaking our colleagues' fingers, taking them in their strong, calloused hands before snapping them like little twigs. They tugged at the body, broken digits twisting them free and leaving nothing but ragged stumps of bone that leaked fresh blood onto the jungle floor. One chimp set about gouging out our colleague's eyes. We knew this not because we could see it in any intimate detail. He was lost in a mass of black fur and flailing limbs, but because his screams made us aware. Mid-scream, one of the chimps had taken a grip of the man's jaw, ripping it free from his skull after a moment of bone-grinding, sinew-severing agony. It made his cries sound choked, inhuman. His cries subsided as he began to drown in his own blood. The last thing I saw before we began to run again was the sight of a chimp ripping away the man's trousers, tearing them open, gripping his genitals before pulling, ripping, rending. They were eating him. We tore past our encampment, ignoring thousands of pounds worth of expensive research equipment, wildly sprinting for the beach, for the boat, for our chance to escape. When we broke through the tree line and onto the beach, there was already a figure on the boat. They must have heard the commotion through the jungle, seen us running and figured it was time to go. I remember thanking God for a moment, a second or two of pure divine thankfulness that something had gone right in the middle of all this madness. But as we got closer, and the hunched figure reared up and turned to us, I felt sick with terror. It was Akinda, his gray muzzle stained crimson with the blood of a dead Tanzanian, lying broken and lifeless on the deck of the boat. His orange eyes burned with violent delight at the sight of us. As he threw the chunk of brown flesh he was gorging on with a wet thunk, he screeched victoriously, sensing our exhaustion, smelling our ripe fear in the air. It seems too strange to think about it now, but I remember feeling a sense of bizarre clarity in those moments. It was all so simple. Akinda was everything. He was God and the devil. Through blood and pain he had crowned himself king. He had tasted power, and he had grown mad with it. It was all so easy to understand, so very human. I stood still, sweating and panting, rooted to the warm, golden sand, and waited to die. Akinda leapt from the boat, hitting the sand at a bound as he hurtled up the beach toward me. You cannot understand how weak and soft it makes you feel, seeing a creature that's so closely related to us display capabilities so much further advanced than our own. His agility and strength were as awe-inspiring as they were horrifying. I felt helpless. Akinda was about to tear my weak, hairless body apart, and there was nothing I could do about it. It happened in an instant. Something in peripheral vision, a blur of black fur, crashed into Akinda and sent him flying off course. I was stunned, well and truly. I had accepted my impending death so completely and utterly that I simply could not bring myself to run to the boat and secure my salvation. I just stared in amazement as a younger chimp faced off against the alpha of the troop. A young, gentle female that now furiously screeched as she bared her teeth to Akinda. It was Farida. She shot me a momentary glance as she kept Akinda at bay, a look in her eyes that I had seen just a short while ago. Run, man thing. Run or die. Akinda beat his fists against the sand in pure, primal fury. He could not allow this display of insolence to go unpunished. We made a dash for the boat, my only surviving colleague diving on board to start the engine as I struggled to push the small craft into the open water. I could hear the battle ensuing behind me, Akinda's apoplectic roars almost drowning out the higher-pitched screams of our savior, Farida. My eyes began to tear up with the siege of emotion as the boat finally began to free itself from the sand, floating freely on the waters of the lake. At last, I heaved myself from the cool, crystal waters and rolled roughly into the boat before pulling myself up onto my hands and knees, just in time to catch one last glance of the Gombe shoreline. Akinda stood over the shattered form of Farida, her chest rising and falling as she lay defeated in the sand. She turned her head towards us, and I swear, we made a brief moment of eye contact as her attacker towered over her broken body. "Thank you," I said softly, my words lost to the sound of the boat's roaring propeller. Akinda brought his fists down on Farida's head with catastrophic force. I couldn't watch. I spent the next 3 months on paid leave from the university before I finally went back to work. Even then, it took me a while to be able to look at a chimpanzee without breaking into a cold sweat and having to politely excuse myself. If it wasn't for Farida, I'm not sure I would ever be able to look at one again. The trip to Tanzania was a failure and a tragic loss of life, but it was not without its lessons. Mankind tries to separate itself from the natural world, to place itself above and apart from the beasts that roam upon the earth. But the more it tries to separate itself, the more obvious it is that we are still just animals, with all the brutality and beastliness that comes with it. Suspicion, envy, tribalism, and war. We saw them all in the chimps of Kigoma, for we were them once, and in time, we may become them again. Hello friends, Mr. X Dreams here. I'd like to thank Let's Read for inviting me over to cover for tonight's video. If you like my voice, join the dreamers over at my YouTube channel, Mr. X Dreams, or go to mrxdreams.com for more. Until next time, friends, take care.